Can you tell me what the role of the fourth estate is, and it's just in a democracy, and then how it with the
Kennedy case.
assassination. Hold it 1 second.
Well, my idea of the fourth estate in democracy, or in any kind of government, democracy, you know, theoretically, even in a monarchy or plutocracy, anything else, ideally, um, the public should have access to information, and particularly so in a democracy, but ideally so in any kind of government, on which to form opinions and on how to vote. You don't know how to vote if you don't know what's going on. The fourth estate plays a crucial role, ideally, in informing the public about what's going on. And it should cast a very wary and skeptical eye to power, to government power, corporate power, any source of power, even church power. Because power, as Lord Acton has said, tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. The public, if it's going to exert its will, in a democracy, uh, has to have knowledge upon which to base an exercise of that will. If the public is denied truthful knowledge about what's going on, uh, it basically subverts the whole idea of democracy. You essentially have a monarchy or a plutocracy where people are operating blindly. Um, I think to a tragic and an unfortunate extent, I think we have a much less free press in the United States than they do in Europe. You have a much broader range of opinion in Europe. In the United States, you have sort of a consensus press. And if it makes it onto the pages of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, the Washington Post, it becomes acceptable to talk about it. If it doesn't, it ends up being not acceptable to talk about it. Um, a recent example of there sometimes being breaches in this was an April 20th, 2008 cover story in the New York Times in which it exposed the fact that military analysts, who were men talking on television to the public and analyzing reports on the war and analyzing reports from the Pentagon, men who have themselves or have had a career in the military and therefore are experts and authorities. It turns out that many of these men had serious conflicts of interest. They were either lobbyists for defense industries looking for business with the Pentagon, or were principals in companies who had business with the Pentagon. And that the Pentagon was shaping their message, telling them what to say, and they were dutifully saying it and reporting back, asking to see whether what the reports they were saying were acceptable to the Pentagon or not, lest perhaps their contracts be canceled. Well, this is a huge violation of the trust that the public expects to be able to invest in the media. And one would have thought that that would have been banner headlines around the country. It made there was virtually no mention made of it in a local press in the Bay Area here. There was an article that did make it to the cover of the Marin newspaper, the Marin Independent Journal. Very little coverage of it in the San Francisco Chronicle. And the mainstream media basically dropped the ball, didn't talk about it very much. Well, this is terribly embarrassing. And this is the way it goes. I think that we saw this happen initially in the Kennedy case, which was in a different era, but for reasons that perhaps aren't all that much different. And that is that perhaps it was a much more trusting era. It was in an era when everybody believed J. Edgar Hoover, that he walked on water and that what he said was true. And so J. Edgar Hoover announced that Oswald had done it and done it alone. Who in America would have challenged that? Of course, that was an era when we now know from an article published by Carl Bernstein called "The CIA and the Media," and in exposés by the Church Committee, that the Central Intelligence Agency had collaborative relationships with our own news media even then. And Google up the CIA and the media, and you can read the whole article, and you can see the declassified documents of the Church Committee. Nobody remembers this anymore. Nobody knows that that power in this country has long sought to subvert the public's getting accurate information about what power is involved in doing. And it certainly was very determined to convince the public that Oswald had acted alone, and I think did a very successful job, at least for the first couple of years. But doubts about the Warren Commission's conclusions surfaced, within about 2 or 3 or 4 years, and since about 64 or 65, or 65 or 66, the majority of people, and sometimes upwards of 80% of people, have not believed the Warren Commission was right. They've smelled a rat all along, um, as they should have. Initially, the Warren Commission, I think, was accepted by the majority of people. Initially, the Warren Commission was believed, but within about 2 or 3 years, by say 65, 66, some doubts began being raised because of very astute pieces of journalism done by people like Ting Thompson and others raising some serious questions that should have been raised a lot earlier and weren't. And then doubts began creeping in, and as time went on, it's been a steady drip, 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 and the public began smelling a rat. They began realizing, hey, wait a minute, how many inconsistencies in the official version are we gonna see before we start realizing that we've been, sold a bill of goods? But still, in that era, everyone believed that anything that J. Edgar Hoover said was true. Certainly, that was true in my family. My parents, who ran John Birch Society chapters when I was growing up, thought that J. Edgar Hoover walked on water. We would have meetings, and my dad would say, "Now, you're not supposed to say anything. Then that guy over there is an FBI agent." We had 2 or 3 FBI agents who would come to our meetings, the John Birch Society, and everybody believed anything that he said. And it was only later that we began realizing, and as time went on, we began realizing more and more and more how J. Edgar Hoover controlled the investigation and corrupted the investigation. And we continue to learn these things. The government continues withholding mountains of documents that it shouldn't. If there's no conspiracy, open and shut case, why are documents being withheld? Why did they withhold them for as many years as they did? Why have so many of the things that they told us publicly turned out not to be true? About the autopsy, about Oswald's history, about his associates, about the history of his associates. How is it a guy who is supposed to be this lone nut commie happens to have no communist friends, not even a leftist friend that we know of? All of his friends happen to be associated with right-wing anti-Castro elements, many of whom are linked to the CIA. The whole legend that we were taught about how it happened, who the guy was, this poor lone nut who got lucky with a rifle one day, all this, despite the difficulty of the feat of the shot itself, which is apparently quite a difficult feat even for trained marksmen, everything else about the story has just fallen apart piece by piece by piece. And consistently, it's fallen as the public's confidence in the government has continued to fall, because we've discovered we've been lied to about so many things from that era forward, the Vietnam War being one of them.
What are the implications today?
Well, I think that the implications today, are, at least in my mind about the Kennedy case, is that anyone who studies the Kennedy case carefully can begin seeing the pattern of how you kill, of how powerful institutions establish a story and work to propagate that story, and how that story ends up being the official story and the accepted story by the major organs, the major outlets, the mainstream media, television news, CBS, NBC, ABC. They will all stay on message. And you begin seeing how the cover-up goes on, how people who dare raise questions are mercilessly ridiculed and demeaned and insulted. It's even gotten meaner in the present era, I think. People who disagreed, for example, that Iraq, for example, posed us any grave threat prior to our invasion, were savaged in the press. I mean, people who raised doubts about it beforehand, who ended up being right, were ridiculed and demeaned and savaged and insulted. And I think that that it should have been a warning to us when we saw how the the truth was subverted back in 1963, that it was important for the press to really distance itself and really report to the public objectively on powerful institutions. And unfortunately, it has not done so, with the consequence that 3 million people were killed in Southeast Asia. Perhaps 500,000 lay dead in graves in dirty wars that we were on the wrong side of in Latin America. We've had a gigantic catastrophe now in Iraq, and the public still isn't being told the truth, and the press, that should be our hero now and is our only hope, is still failing us. We deserve a lot more than that. And I don't know that we, given the interlocking relationships between huge business and mainstream media, I don't know that that we're going to get that anymore. Thank God for the internet. Thank God for the fact that I was able to read online Le Monde, the British press, and other press about the Iraq War before we invaded, because it was only there, really, and the McClatchy newspapers, which Knight Ridder, thank God for that lonely voice. But the mainstream media basically, is establishment up and down the line, and if it becomes convenient for the establishment to tell the public lies, to support wars, to support cover-ups of assassinated presidents, to support corrupt military dictators who happen to be our allies, the mainstream media seems all too willing to do so, and it is a tremendous loss to the public. We'd like to think that our institutions of free press are the strongest in the world. I would say that they're far from the strongest. I don't know if they're the weakest. That would probably take some doing, but I don't think they're nearly as strong as they should be, and not as strong as they are in almost any country in Western Europe.
So, where do we go? Where do we go from here? It's interesting that you said the press need them to do their job. You said they're the last hope.
The last time,
But it's the independent researchers that really work.
well, and again, it has been the independent researchers in the Kennedy case who basically were the forerunners of the internet, in the sense that it was individuals and not the mainstream media who began catching the government in so many lies that were published by the Warren Commission and afterward by the mainstream media. It was individual researchers who then had organs of communication which were quite crude by modern day standards, small newsletters, telephone conversations, letters back and forth, small circulation publications, an occasional letter to the editor in a larger outlet, or a book. I think that the only hope really for the future now are outlets like the internet, where I have learned now no longer to trust what I read in the New York Times, the Washington Post. I read it with some regularity just to see what the official line is going to be. And then to find out what's really going on, I read the independent press. I read the London Guardian, the London Independent. Sydney Morning Herald is good. Asia Times is good. Anybody can get these online almost any time. And I also read a lot of news sources online. Consortiumnews.com is excellent. Raw Story, commondreams.org, truthout.org, truthdig.org. These are sources of news that will give you a much more objective view of what's going on than what you'll hear on Fox or the New York Times. Fox and the New York Times basically were singing from the same songbook in the run up to the Iraq War.
So where do we go from here?
If somehow, where do we go? I tell you where I'd love to go. I'd love to fire every journalist who basically is caught acting as a shill for the government. Everyone, for example, the journalists who had their pictures on the cover of New York Times April 20th edition, every one of the military analysts should have been fired the next day. Uh, but when you have NBC being owned by a big military contractor, who's going to fire him? When you have ABC and CBS having huge relationships with large military industrial companies, who's going to fire them? That's what ought to happen. I think our only hope really is the internet. And where we go from here is to continue to remind the public that um, if you want to understand what corporate interests want you to believe is true, uh, you read the New York Times. If you want to understand what is really true, you're going to have to go beyond the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC, and particularly Fox News. You're going to have to go to independent news sources. Otherwise, you're going to get Fox News having a talking head military analyst telling you how the war is going, who will be profiting mightily if the war keeps going. And so he's going to be telling you it's going swimmingly. Keep sending us your tax dollars. I mean, it's a tragedy. And I don't know any other way than to continually challenge the mainstream media with the internet. And I hope that the internet is not reined in somehow, and I fear that it might be. How they would go about doing that, I don't know. But I worry about the independence of the internet.
How about your do you have faith in this? Can you tell me about your faith? Do you believe it?
That it can do it? If unfortunately, I think that the thing that made me, I've lost a lot of faith, and I'm much less hopeful than I was. I'll put it this way: my spirit soared when I saw a front page New York Times story blowing the whistle on the fact that the Pentagon was directly controlling the mainstream media news analysts reporting on the war. I mean, why didn't they just hire Pentagon paid employees to tell us how the war was going and ignore independent journalism if what independent journalists were doing was doing that? I had a patient in the office who was a Russian, and we were talking about this. I said, well, it's really terrible here. He said, no, it's much worse in Russia. And I said, no, I think it's much worse here. He said, no, much worse in Russia. I said, no, with respect to the press. Terrible. Pravda was terrible. I said, okay. Did you believe Pravda? Oh, no, we knew it was government propaganda. I said, did anyone you know believe Pravda? He said, well, a few people, yes, but they were government bureaucrats. Yes, they believed him, but no, most of us, we knew. Like almost everybody didn't believe. Yeah, well, we knew that you could rely on some of the stuff, but when they talked about what the government was doing, we knew it was government propaganda. I said, that's the difference between Russia in the USSR and today. People believe Fox News, CBS, NBC, ABC. They believe the military analysts are objectively reporting on the war. They're being deceived much more effectively. This is George Orwell on steroids, what's happened with the media now. This is a manipulation of the public where the public thinks it's hearing nothing but the truth from men of absolutely, impeccable credentials and impeccable ethics who are telling us the truth that we need to know so that we can vote and so that we can form an opinion. These men are paid shills of the military industrial complex. I mean, it's a complete scandal, and it's much more effective and much more sinister. So I thought when that story in the New York Times came out that this was perhaps the most important story in the last 15 or 20 years that I'd seen. And there have been a lot of really important stories, but they get buried in the back pages. But that was a great one, a very important one. The story died almost. Very little, echoes afterward, and certainly none. Fox News wouldn't touch it. ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, almost no discussion. Very little discussion of it.
And how does this relate back to the Kennedy?
And it relates back to the Kennedy case because it becomes apparent to me that when power decides that certain subjects are not to be developed, they're just not developed. If the question that Oswald might not have acted alone had reverberated long enough and hard enough, people might have wondered whether the United States had been victimized by a coup, by people who are still at large. That story had to die. It was killed. It's stayed dead from the standpoint that the government isn't going to act on it. The power of the press, at least the major organs, are not going to act on it. And so the story will stay dead. The public will stay manipulated, just as they are continually being manipulated today, uh, and have been in the propagation of our current war. Um, I am much less optimistic. I'm fortunately positioned to be able to move to another country and live independently for the rest of my life. But I have three kids here. I worry very much for them and for the country they're inheriting. Are they going to be inheriting a country that has a war, a military machine that basically runs the press as well as running the government, deciding what the future is going to be and what the public is allowed to know? It's very frightening for the future of the country, and yet I wish I could see another alternative to that. I wish I could see that when an outlet like the New York Times finally does something courageous. I mean, after all, with Judy Miller's stories terrifying the public about the imminence of the threat that we faced if we didn't get rid of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, they stood foursquare with the government with all the untruths that a lot of people were pounding the table telling us were untrue. Warren Strobel for Knight Ridder was telling us, hey, these are all exaggerations. All the people we know are saying these things are hugely exaggerated. You didn't hear that in the mainstream. The mainstream allied itself with the military to propagate the war and got their war. And now, what? Ultimately, we're going to be anywhere from $2 to $5 trillion poorer for this. We have an infrastructure that is eroding. Our roads are much worse than they are almost anywhere in Europe. Our internet is much less efficient than it is certainly anywhere in Japan. Our educational system isn't what it damn well ought to be. Our poor are poorly cared for. We have no health insurance for what, 45 million Americans? And we spend, by some accounts, something on the order of $1.5 trillion a year on defense. It's an enormous amount of money.
Finally, I guess I just want to ask you, what did Kennedy mean to you?
Kennedy, to sum up Kennedy, I think that Kennedy was the last president. This is I got a good one for you on this. I think
I bumped the tripod at the beginning of that.
Okay, that's fine.
Sitting in this chair for.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah, we're all. Am I still looking in the right direction? Am I okay?
You're fine.
Okay. Want to go with Kennedy again? What did Kennedy represent? I think, in retrospect, I think that Kennedy was probably the last president to really challenge the military-industrial complex. And it's a strong statement to make, and yet I'm fairly convinced it's true, and this is why I think so. He came into the presidency as the youngest man in upper echelons of this government. Uh, he came in, and upon arrival in office, he is told that, well, we have this Bay of Pigs plan all set to go for April 1961, and it's been cleared at all levels of government. Joint Chiefs of Staff are onto it. Everyone else has signed on to it. This is going to work well. We're going to let the Cubans go back in and grab the island again back from Castro. And he had some misgivings. It sounded kind of like a crackpot scheme, but all the wiser heads around him, and he was the youngest man in the administration, and so he reluctantly went along with it. And afterward, when it ended up being such an abysmal failure, and the men were pinned down on the beaches, they came to him and they said, "Well, listen, we just happen to have some ships offshore. Can we send in some reinforcements?" And he said, no. He said, you told me America's hand would not have to show in this, and it will not show in this. I am not going to make this an American venture. And he infuriated the Pentagon by doing that. But that radicalized Kennedy, I think, in that moment. And also he realized he could not trust even his military advisors on matters military. He basically knew and became very skeptical and very cynical about what he was being told. And that cynicism, I think, marked the rest of his tenure until he died. He then pushed against the military, which was insisting he send troops into Laos. He wouldn't let him do it. And they were furious about that. He proposed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty against military advice and recommendations. They were furious about that. The Joint Chiefs of Staff came up with this crackpot theory, which I encourage anyone to Google up and read for themselves. They can read the declassified documents called Operation Northwoods. And in Operation Northwoods, the Pentagon, still looking for a fight with Castro, had planned to commit acts of terrorism, use that word, on Americans, kill Americans, blame it on Castro as a pretext for another war. Kennedy wouldn't let him do that either. And then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as many people have noticed, and as Zelikoff and May, or May and Zelikoff in their book, The Kennedy Tapes, who transcribed the actual conversations of Kennedy talking about what they were going to do during those fateful 13 days when we were eyeball to eyeball with the Russians in nuclear brinksmanship. Zelikoff and May say that Kennedy's was often the only voice in the room determined not to go to war. Here he was against all his advisors saying, no, no, no. They wanted to attack the island, drop nukes, and invade the island and take it over. And he wouldn't let them do that. Ultimately ended up being a success. And then finally, on the question of Vietnam, Oliver Stone was savage for suggesting in his film JFK that Kennedy would not have prosecuted that war. And in fact, some historians, most notably Howard Jones, a research historian at the University of Alabama, in a book called Death of a Generation, Oxford University Press published book, again, a good academic publishing house, wrote on page 8, how do you like that? I don't remember the page number, of the book. He said that when I first heard accounts that Jack Kennedy would have prosecuted this war, I just thought that was nuts. He said that now, in view of the mountains of declassified document, it is very clear that the one most adamant foe of militarizing or making that America's war was Jack Kennedy. He would not have fought that war. And in fact, I think he wrote the whole book because he was so shocked to discover that. Well, since then, it is clear to all historians virtually that Kennedy would not have fought the war in Vietnam. So Kennedy infuriated the military at the Bay of Pigs. He infuriated them not sending troops to Laos. He infuriated them by not approving Operation Northwoods. He infuriated them during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that they decided, you're not going to infuriate us again about Vietnam. And they got their war. 3 million dead Southeast Asians later, and God knows how many millions with birth defects left due to our Agent Orange and other, things that we left behind, and 58,000 dead Americans and 150 or 200,000 injured. I think that Kennedy's legacy was that he stood against the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned us about, and I submit he paid for that with his life. And I don't know that anyone has had the courage to challenge it since. And of course, given what happened to Kennedy, one can well understand why, and no one will want to challenge it. So what does Kennedy mean to me? He means he was perhaps, in some respects, certainly in retrospect, the last great hope for the United States. And one can only hope that someone like him will come along in the future. There can be no certainty about these things, though.
Was there anything that's great? Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to say?
Well, I think that one of the things that's important for the public to know, particularly about the Kennedy case and our current situation now, is that here we are, well over 40 years, going on 45 years after Kennedy is dead, and the government that has told us that it's an open and shut case. Oswald did it, nothing to write home about. It is still hiding documents. It is still suppressing documents that it won't tell the public about. Why? We have seen the government go into an even more aggressive secret mode in recent years in this war in Iraq. They are now suppressing more information from the public than they ever have before. Whole, libraries of information about how we got into this war, about what we knew and when we knew it, are now being withheld from the public. What kind of a democracy is it if the public is not allowed the basic information it needs to cast an informed vote? I mean, an informed electorate is the bedrock of democracy. If you have a bamboozled electorate, a disinformed electorate, you have democracy then in name only, and it is a sham democracy. If the Kennedy case should have taught us anything, it is you release everything. You release everything. And if you really have a democracy, and if the truth is a tough, tough truth, the public can deal with it. Always have. The public can tolerate it. Look, the public rallied around Bill Clinton after his Monagate scandal, despite the fact it was a fairly sleazy affair. Listen, we can deal with it. We can, move on. We understand as human beings, all of whom who live lives, understand that there are difficulties that happen. The public should be trusted, and the government that does not trust the public is the government that victimizes the public. And we've been victims of a type of secrecy which has deprived us of freedom and democracy in this country. And the press should, above all other organs in the society, be clamoring for an end to that secrecy. And their voices have been remarkably muted. They've been there, and my hat's off to them whenever they're there, but they haven't been nearly as vocal enough, and they haven't nearly championed the cause of openness to the extent that they should, to the extent that we need if we're going to be anything that even resembles democracy now. It's a long time overdue, and I only hope for the sake of my kids that we somehow get there. I wish I were more optimistic than I am.
Why is there so much apathy and kind of a general sleepiness towards all of this?
Why is there? Yeah, why is there an apathy? Well, you one way of looking at it, or one way I sort of think about it, is that let's say that you have a really noisy, obstreperous kid, you know, and he's always banging around, making a lot of noise. And when he first starts doing that, and this is fairly new for him, but he's turning 13, and so he's starting to feel his oats a bit. And at first, you come down pretty hard because you're trying to read or watch television, do whatever you're doing. He's making too much noise. And if he is persistent enough at it, and persistent enough at it, and persistent enough at it, I've seen it happen in families where I go in and the kid's just making a lot of racket, and the parents just say, he's just a kid, and they put up with it after a while. And I think that there's apathy in America today because the public really rose up during the Vietnam era for one of the important reasons is that their own sons and daughters of people who were people of wealth and influence had their kids over there being shot to death in a war that was being conducted under a sea of lies. That didn't sit well with the public, and I think parents encouraged their kids, and kids who themselves were fearful of being drafted and sent off to their deaths resisted. The lesson was learned, the draft was eliminated, and now wars have been outsourced to private companies who, rather than the American public paying $25,000 to $30,000 for conscriptee to fight our wars, we now pay $100,000 to $150,000 for a company to hire somebody to go do a lot of that kind of work, same work. And the public is kept mollified because their sons and daughters are not there unless they want to be there. And then the other thing is that the public has been out there, protesting. They protested quite vehemently about the war before we got started, and they've been protesting over and over and over again, and it has fallen on deaf ears. Dick Cheney was asked, 6 weeks ago, or three or 4 weeks ago, well, what does it mean to you that 75% of the public disagrees with your policy in the war? And he says, so what? And that's the attitude of the government. Well, the public realizes that they're powerless in the situation. The mainstream media basically does the bidding of the military-industrial complex, and the public is powerless to do anything about it. And the public's press, its champion, its supposed champion in these affairs, does nothing about it. Individuals now feel totally incapable of doing anything to change the situation. And I think that there is apathy only because there's hopelessness, and it's a different thing, hopelessness, than apathy. I think it is the thought, what difference does it make? I feel strongly about it, but I know I'll only end up being unhappy. Nothing will change, and the people who are making the decisions, who have the power to make the decisions, and who are doing these things, will say, "Who cares?" And so we all want to find a little joy in our life. We turn away from that which is an endless and continuous frustration because we know that the champions that might have been there, the Woodward and Bernsteins that might have been there, the Daniel Ellsbergs that was there once upon a time, the Robert Perry who was there for the Ron Contra story there once upon a time. Those guys aren't there anymore. They're not there to champion our cause. We've got no one on our side. What's for dinner? Is there a comedy on tonight? Can I somehow forget this terrible thing that's going on as our dollar is losing its value, our prestige in the world is losing its value, our reputation as a country that condones torture, extraordinary rendition, a violation of international law, and all bounds of propriety, as these things all disappear, and there's no one, pounding the table in a loud enough way that someone who is in a position, somebody like Cheney, can say, "Oh, well, they do care," I guess I better care. There's no one out there now who has the power to change that, it seems to us. And so the apathy is, I think, not so much apathy as it is an honest realization of a certain amount of hopelessness of the situation. And I wish it were otherwise. I think the last time there were that amount of great hope was during the Kennedy administration, and perhaps for a brief period of time after the protests succeeded in our finally yanking out of Vietnam. I think there was a sense that we'd finally been able to influence this terrible machine and finally forced it to stop the war. Since that time, the powers of the machine have regrouped. The warfare state is back in full operation. It's learned how to control the message that the press publicizes directly through its own spokespeople, that are the talking heads, who then, call back very meekly, asking to see if their messages are approved or are agreeable to the government. I mean, it's a terrible situation we're in now, and it's a certain amount of hopelessness. It's not apathy so much, I don't think, as hopelessness, and I feel somewhat hopeless as well. Don't most people? I mean, most people I know do. Terrible situation.
That's great. That's great.